This is the Art of Network Engineering podcast. In this podcast, we'll explore tools, technologies, and talented people. We aim to bring you information that will expand your skill sets and toolbox and share the stories of fellow network engineers. Welcome to the Art of Network Engineering. I am AJ Murray, and I am joined this evening by Tim Bertino. He is at Tim Bertino on Twitter. Tim, I love the hat you got there. Look at that.
You too, man.
Gotta love the new swag. We recently got some new swag hats for both podcasts. We got some shirts, got some jackets, and of course the hat. So nice to rock the logo. It's so cool. Like, you know, we've built the podcast up. We started Cables to Clouds earlier this year. We see the logos all over the place. But when I picked up that embroidered gear from the shop, I was like, this is too cool.
And they did a fantastic job. This was a place local to you there in Vermont, and it's very, very well done stuff. Yeah.
So what's new, Tim? How you doing?
So what's new? Actually, a lot with the podcast. I've been putting in a decent amount of time. We've been fortunate enough to have some more sponsorships lately, and we're doing some different kind of content than what we're used to. You know, we usually do either straight up podcast episodes or YouTube videos, and we've been getting into the short form. Been having to do a little bit of the TikTok and the like, and it's been interesting. I've been doing some more behind the camera time, and luckily we got to do a decent amount with a bulk of the team when we were out there in Knoxville recently. So it's been a lot of fun and exciting stuff that we can't wait to share with everybody coming up here pretty soon.
Yeah. Tim, you're a genius. Like the stuff that you have come up with and written, it's great stuff. I cannot wait to share it with you all. I just want to explode and tell everybody like what we're doing. And you know what, we probably could, because by the time we edit this and get it out there, I'm sure there are content will
it'll be out in the wild. Yeah.
But no, it was really fun to record that stuff in person. And then, you know, I had no idea what you had done for the second video, and you had uploaded all your clips, and I started pulling them down. I will say my favorite part is the outtakes.
Yep. I hold nothing back in the outtakes because I know, and actually I should say I hope and pray that AJ doesn't release most of those publicly.
No, just for the team.
Yeah. So what's new with you, AJ? At the time of recording here, we're nearing the end of summer and getting into what I call the best season of the year, that is fall/autumn. So what's new out in Vermont?
Well, the leaves, they are a changing. We've gotten a ton of rain this year, and all estimates say that because of the additional rain, we're going to see some really poppin' color this fall. So we're going to get, you know, last year, the leaves changed. They change every year regardless. But last year it was a really dry summer, and all of the tones in the fall were rather muted, right? Like they still got the nice oranges and reds and stuff like that, but they didn't pop like they normally do. So I'm really hoping for a really beautiful fall. I'm trying to time it. I'm trying to figure out when peak fall is going to hit, because I'm going to take a couple days off from work, charge up my camera batteries, charge up my drone batteries, and I'm just going to set out across the state to see what I can get for my photography stuff. So it's always a fun time of year. And then, you know, like you said, we've been working on the extra content. So I've been, you know, burning a little midnight oil, editing that stuff. So for our listeners who aren't aware yet, we are on TikTok. And you can find us just like you find us anywhere on our social media. We are at Art of Net Eng. And, you know, we're putting out content. We found some nice little AI driven tools that help us take our long form episodes and dice them up into some nice short form content. So that helps as far as the content creation goes on those platforms. And, you know, it's actually taken off. We're starting to get some good followers there. And I think we're starting to build the listenership. We've slowly seen the downloads start to tick up here as we're reaching new audience members on these platforms. So it's pretty exciting stuff.
And I got to give you some props on that too, because you do all of the, and not just for the short form. I mean, for everything we do with the podcast and YouTube, you do a bulk of the editing. And with this short form content, I've really just been handing you rough video, and what you're turning it into is really cool, man. We really appreciate what you're doing.
It's fun. It's nice to have a creative outlet that has absolutely nothing to do with IT, right? So,
and I mean, at the end of the day, it's a skill set, right, that you can use in the future.
Yep, absolutely. Well, let's dive in, shall we? I'm very excited to welcome our guest to the show this evening. His name is Tony Dubiel, and he is the Product Solutions Architect for Ansible Network Automation at Red Hat. Thank you so much for joining us, Tony, and welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's awesome.
So what exactly is a Product Solutions Architect for Ansible Network Automation?
Okay, so Ansible is a product and an open source initiative, right? So I work for Red Hat, and we have account teams that cover what we call North America public sector. So that's all the federal and state and local government, types of customers. So I'm an overlay that supports our customers, for Ansible, but my focus is network automation. So anything to do with Ansible and network automation, I help them in terms of sometimes just demonstrations, proof of concepts, enablements, workshops, all the things to kind of help them move forward and make sure that they can adopt the product and have success with whatever kind of use cases they're trying to drive through the network space.
Okay, very very cool. When I hear a product solutions architect, that could be a couple of things, right? You could be a person that has a marketing, sales background, that's maybe learning how to do some of this network automation stuff to show off. You might have a networking background and you've got really good people skills, and that's why you're doing the talks and stuff like that. So which is it? Can you give us a background on your career? How did you end up here as a product solutions architect?
Yeah, so I go pretty far back in the a traditional network engineer.
Okay.
In terms of my career, so in the earliest days, I was in the Air Force as a tech controller, and I was working with old school, Cisco routers, 2500s, 7500s, stuff like that. So pretty far back, dating myself. And when I got out, for a while I worked in the federal space with contractors and primarily gravitating around Cisco stuff. And over time, I got the route switch CCIE, and that opened a lot of doors for me. And moving forward, I started liking the pre-sale side of things because it was a little bit less of cutovers and uncertainty, with my work-life balance and all that kind of stuff. So I moved into a couple of Cisco partners, and then eventually I was in Cisco. So in terms of that type of role, supporting products, it was primarily around within an architecture, you have certain products. So in Cisco, I worked in service provider space. I was in enterprise for a while, commercial, and some of their public sector, covering, different products, but doing a lot of the same things where, you're helping the customer adopt the solution. And in the pre-sales capacity, you're usually giving away some free consulting. There's opportunities for you to continue to have your hands-on, skill set and maintain it because you're helping them with proof of concepts and things in their own environment, they're doing bake-offs and different trials against solutions. So, not as hands-on as you would be post-sales, but you still, have the opportunities.
Sure.
So I went into collaboration. I was a voice CCIE, so I did that for a while at Cisco, and then data center. Data center is where I was introduced into automation. So, but it actually wasn't. Well, it was kind of because of the network, but it was mainly because of OpenStack. If you're familiar with that,
okay,
particular technology. So that was kind of a private cloud alternative, like VMware and and other virtualization types of solutions, and kind of before all the public cloud stuff really came to light, and before a lot of adoption even to AWS. So those APIs. A lot of times, they were perfect candidates to use Ansible. So I learned Ansible because of OpenStack. But Neutron was the service in Ansible for networking. So I was using that, to configure, even Cisco devices could, provide gateway capabilities for OpenStack and things like that. But folks started really looking at traditional networking and automation. So that opened my eyes to there's so many possibilities to avoid all these GUIs that we have to deal with. So death by 1,000 clicks where it takes forever to provision anything, or you want to make things repeatable, right? So you don't sit there, and spend the whole weekend. So I was like, there's a lot of, opportunity to improve that experience. So in Cisco, I was fortunate to move into an automation role. So for a while, I was in enterprise and I was focused on programmability and automation for our customers in Enterprise South. So that was like customers that were from the Carolinas down to Florida and then over to Texas. And it included like everything like Walmart and Exxon and Home Depot, like pretty much anything you think of, banks and things. It was just all just depending on the size of the customer, they would fall into that bucket. And they had like so many different, possible use cases for automation because they would, a lot of them would have like tons of different Cisco solutions and they were all different, especially earlier on before all of the unification of APIs, where a lot of this stuff, like even within a vendor, would be so different in how you would authenticate and use and consume their APIs. So it was really difficult for me because just like understanding all the Cisco solutions and how to configure them manually. Okay, then how do you translate that, into interacting with the APIs or like, the command lines if we're talking about routers and switches, but being able to use multiple tools because, not everybody likes Ansible. Some people, gravitate more towards Python types of tools, like now with like Nornir and APAM and NetMiko and those types of things. So I had to know a little bit about that. For more of the cloud networking stuff, Terraform was really popular.
Yep.
And for folks that were dealing with a lot of REST APIs, they might be using something like Postman. And then they're really like, the Postman's easy, but it's like understanding the APIs, those raw API calls is kind of difficult. So trying to do all that and sustain everything, it's really tough. So I think that's the challenge that a lot of people have is they started to, figure out, what tools now that they're going to commit to. And then really starting to double down on them and really build the skill sets. So I think now, like, it's taken a lot of years to take off. And DevNet, from Cisco really helped things along. And Hank Preston, I got, had opportunities to work with him and he's awesome. And kind of like, he really helped build a lot of the whole notion of net DevOps and getting, networking people excited about automating. But like, it's really taken like 5 years for people to really start to, now I think people are really starting to implement it. It's becoming more mainstream. Which, there's pros and cons to that too, because there's a lot of people that are looking for help.
Yeah.
There's no shortage of people that need, and a lot of people, just need that help to get started. And then once they get far enough along, then they're going to be okay. But, there's, just enablement and those types of things. So
yeah,
sorry, I kind of went off in tangents and stuff, but that's kind of like, going, that transition type of thing.
That was fantastic. So did I count 3 CCIEs, route switch, voice, and DC?
Yeah.
Wow.
Jeez. And I do, before we jump into automation and tools, I want to step back to the base network engineering days. So you went from route switch into DC and collaboration. I mean, you really, the only thing you didn't mess with, and at least that you're calling out, is wireless. So was that on purpose that you really specialized in those 3 tracks, or did it just kind of happen along the way?
Well, actually, I did pursue security CCIE at one point, but I was doing like vulnerability assessments and things like that, and I was kind of it was different because it was like security devices and architecture versus like incident response and assessments kind of thing. So I kind of didn't know which way to take that. But then that's when collaboration came along, and then I really liked collaboration because it was really cool when a lot of people were cutting over from their PBXs, into call manager, and just that whole process was a lot of planning and and a lot of work enablement to help the people understand this whole new paradigm of voice over IP. And then the call centers were like their own beast because they would have the IVR systems, and that was like a programming type of thing too. So I really enjoyed like Call Center and Call Center Express, and helping, create those scripts and things like that. So that was like another area. I guess I could probably point to that as being like the first automation type of thing before the OpenStack. But it's just, a little bit different because that was more like, Cisco had that like Java, scripting interface that you would use to create those scripts. But
well, and to me, that's like the perfect, being a network engineer is like the perfect background for somebody getting into collaboration, because it's all, like you said before, it was the analog or the PBX systems, and then it was voice and collaboration over IP. So somebody that really understands the, for lack of a better term, meat and potatoes of networking is, to me, perfect for collaboration.
Yeah, and there's a lot of like, ISDN and SIP trunks and things that fell more on the network side. So it was like you really needed network people to adopt that technology, where I think they would have a better chance to succeed than like a lot of the traditional PBX folks trying to adopt, all this new technology around it. So it was really like an inflection point for network engineers to like to go in that area. And I kind of feel that way around network automation too, where I think, having like the experience on the network side and then learning to adopt automation is a little bit easier for folks that may, be more of a developer and then trying to understand all these different aspects of networking, because you're talking about so many different vendors, so many different types of devices. And even like within a certain category of device, like routers and switches, as an example, it's so different in the data center versus the campus versus the WAN. And then versus like colo facilities, or like if you're trying to do networking between public clouds or hybrid cloud, on-prem, off-prem, it's like there's so much to know on the back end and the intent of what you're trying to build. But like for networking folks, sometimes it's kind of like, is the juice worth the squeeze? Because if you can use the portals and you're comfortable there and the command lines and the GUI to some extent, do you always have to automate? So it really just depends on like how often you have to make changes and how many touch points you have, where you might make that, that choice on, I really should, adopt the technology or not. But I'm all in, and it's taken about 4 or 5 years. And then now I can automate just about anything, anything that comes up, I can figure it out. It's just a matter of time to figure out how do you do it manually? Then how can I, take that and then transition that into an automation and make sure it manifests itself with the same outcomes that it did, originally. So,
all right, I've got a super loaded question. you mentioned earlier that a lot of folks, I mean, really myself included, don't have a lot of experience around automation and they don't know where to start. And you also mentioned that there's a large number of different tools out there. Do you feel like network engineers need to settle on that tool of Python or Ansible or XYZ, or do you see there being value in having different tools in an environment because you may have different use cases?
Yeah, I think different tools for different use cases, but for the individual, I think it's always a good idea to explore Python. Even if you're not planning on building, becoming a full developer and building like applications with Python, I think it's a good idea to understand the basics, because just about every vendor has like a Python SDK for their APIs. So if you really wanted to, and if you learn how to like build Python scripts up to the point where you can use functions and then call like these classes that they create, they do all the heavy lifting on the back end with their SDKs. And then they take care of all that communication on the REST APIs and turn those into parameters. And then you're just using those parameters in your Python script. If you can get to that level, that's fine. But that may work for you. But then how do you work with like a team of other folks that may not have the time or be able to sustain like a skill set enough to like interact at that level with Python? So that's where I was. So I was like, hey, I can do all these things, but then I would show it to a customer and they would be, impressed by it, or maybe they would want to use it. And then maybe a couple of folks would be able to take it and run with it like in their environment. But then what happens when they leave? Were they able to enable like the other folks around them? So like that's kind of back to the abstraction thing too, is like, can you hand it off to people in an easier method so that they can use it without having to know like all of the underpinnings of how it works? So the reason why I still think it's valuable, like if you can learn Python, you have the time, do that. Because what you can do is like Ansible is a Python application, it's built on Python. And when you run a module in Ansible, you're interacting with a playbook, and all you need to know is YAML. And all you're doing is defining parameters in a YAML playbook, right? So normally you don't hard code those, you'll variabilize them. And it's just a module and it'll have parameters, and certain parameters are required for like the configuration. Some of them are optional. And if you don't know what they are, you can look at the documentation and it has all the parameters listed out. So most people can figure out how to do that in a basic playbook. But behind the scenes, it's a Python script that's running for that module. And these days, the way that it works is the vendor creates those. So they kind of do the heavy lifting. But if you know Python, you can go and create your own Python scripts. And then you just go through and use certain libraries for Ansible, so you can turn it into an Ansible module. And then you can abstract for other folks where it was kind of hard to do that using just Python. Maybe you have to do like a Django front end or something like that, and it's like a lot more coding on your part. But this way, it's like Ansible already has it set up, so you can kind of hide your Python in the background, and other people can use it and consume it. And it's like either consumed through a playbook, or you can even dumb it down further with self-service using a survey in the Ansible controller, or using something like ServiceNow or another ITSM sitting in front of it, and then they just would have like, drop down forms and things like that to populate data, or something fancier like an info box or netbox or something that's an IPAM, and then they're filling out all that information and it just gets pushed, into Ansible. But
okay, so you're already kind of blowing my mind here. And before we get a little any deeper, I want to have a little bit of a vocabulary lesson.
Okay.
So when we talk about things like this, I've heard multiple ways to frame this up that I think are really different. So I want to take a minute and talk about some of the different things that you've said. There are concepts of, within automation, there's concepts of abstraction, orchestration, and automation. And I'm told those are not synonymous things. Can you kind of define what those three concepts are?
Yeah. So automation, or this is, just my viewpoint of it. But for the most part, automation is just taking task, right? Because, a human could complete a task in a certain order. So there's a process, right? So there's step 1, step 2, step 3, and then you either succeed or fail. So automation is simply just taking that and then automating it, and you can think of that as kind of like the scripting, or in this case, a playbook in Ansible. And that would be automation. Orchestration is where you may have tasks that have different purposes that may need to occur like at a different time, and maybe like the output of a certain task is a requirement, a dependency for the input for like another task. So you might have like these conditions in between. So a lot of times orchestration tools will have like, different conditions, different like succeed, fail, or like always states, like what do you want to do if it passes or fails. It's more complex. So normally it's stitching together like multiple scripts, or in this case, in Ansible, it'll be stitching together like multiple playbooks or multiple roles, or kind of like a fancier playbook. And orchestration would give you like integrations into things outside of automation, like roles-based access, as an example, or other services for credentials and things like that, or integrations into other tools too, that typically you wouldn't have like a playbook interacting directly with these things. It would be a consequence of having orchestration. So our automation controller is an orchestrator. So you could think of it as more of like the platform is kind of where the orchestration capabilities are more advanced, in that sense.
Okay, so you're stitching multiple tasks or multiple playbooks together, and that's orchestration. Things that could be dependent upon each other. Okay,
but it could be multiple like things outside of automation too, like your ITSM.
Oh,
IPAM,
interesting. Okay,
or something like Cisco ICE for like policy. Yeah, so there's with orchestration, there's tons of things you can do. It's very powerful in that sense.
So Tony, you said a few minutes ago where now there's a lot of people that are doing network automation, and I think as opposed to 4, 5, 6 years ago, and I think there's a really big factor in why that is. So I remember 5 or 6 years ago when everyone was just like, you got to learn Python. You got to learn Python. Network automation is going to be this great thing. You got to learn Python. So, so you go on to Pluralsight or CBT or wherever, and you learn Python, but you don't learn it in a network automation context. You're just learning Python. And it's like, great, I learned Python. Now what? But over the years, Cisco DevNet with developer advocates like, in a past life for you and Hank Preston and then lots of other content creators out there now have created this network automation context for us to go and consume this material. And, I always refer to Ansible as the gateway drug for network automation, because you're right. You don't need to know Python. You don't need to know any crazy scripting languages. You just need to understand YAML. And if you can understand YAML, you're golden. And you know the command line syntax for the platform that you're working with, be it Cisco, Juniper, or Arista, or whatever, right? That those are the only two things you really need to be successful with Ansible. Now, all that being said, let's define what is Ansible. What are some of the parts to it? I know that there's an open source product in there. There's like a paid for product. I've done a lot of work with the open source piece. I've put a few how-to blog articles together to get network engineers started, in their network automation journey. So let's kind of define what is Ansible. What are some of the parts and pieces to it? You mentioned playbooks. What are some of the other things that we need to put Ansible together to get it working for us?
Okay, so like Ansible core engine is the same, regardless if we're talking about open source, or if we're talking about the product, or really any of the tooling that uses Ansible. Like even if you're running Ansible and like GitLab or something on a runner, the Ansible core engine is the same thing. So that core software, has the automation capabilities of Ansible. So when you execute automation, that's the Ansible core engine. Mm-hmm. Where it's a bit different is like when I mentioned the Ansible Automation Platform, there's that, right? The Ansible core engine. How we use it has changed. It's evolved a little bit because a lot of people are familiar with Tower as being the product from Ansible. But currently in the Ansible Automation Platform, what used to be Tower is now called the controller. But there's additional components as well that are a part of the platform that didn't exist in the days of Tower. So what we've done is kind of like re-architected it and decoupled, some of the responsibilities that used to be in Tower so that it would be more cloud native and be able to scale better. In terms of high availability and performance, mm-hmm. right? So that's changed as well. So the Ansible core engine today lives in a container, because we're moving, more into this containerized, world of everything. So if you used Ansible core engine in the past, you would have to install it into. Normally, the best practice would be install it in a Python virtual environment. Mm-hmm. So that way all the dependencies have a wrapper around it. So you're using like the right version of Python and all the other modules that you need and whatever else, Ansible requires. You can install it, but you have to keep installing it everywhere you're using it. Mm-hmm. So there's always that chance that if you're working with somebody else, there might be a small nuance, a different version of something that they're using or a different collection and that type of thing. And it's hard to police that because if you're troubleshooting something that doesn't work, it could be a bug, but it might just be like the version, and it's hard for like teams to work that way. Mm-hmm. With it being in a container, you can version control these execution environment containers, and they'll have like the specific version of the collections. So the collections is how we package the modules today. And you can go to Galaxy as the community, the open source community, and you can use the collections from various vendors there. But the product has certified collections. So certified collections are effectively the same thing, but the vendor goes through additional vetting, and it's supported through the subscription, through the product. So you can open up a ticket, and then Red Hat will troubleshoot with the vendor for you, as opposed to the open source side of things. If you have a problem, you find the contributor, whatever, vendor or individuals that are responsible for that particular module in that collection, and you go to GitHub and you log an issue. And then they'll try to help you, but there's no agreement or service contract or, anything like that. So, but it's, it's that same paradigm, but like in the Ansible product, the controller is like kind of like managing automation, right? Mm-hmm. So if you had Tower, it did the same thing. It's like, I have all these playbooks. Do I want to run them from my laptop or from a server, or, in cloud or whatever? Or do I want to run them from like a in this case, the controller, which has additional capabilities to manage those jobs or those playbook runs? So who has access to them with roles-based access? And the jobs themselves, because I may want to increase or tune, based off of how many devices I'm connecting to. So there's additional capabilities in that regard. Like if I want to do job slicing, or, I can do forks and serial and those types of things in my playbook to kind of make them run better, like parallelism, like how many playbooks do you want to, or how many endpoints do you want to touch at the same time?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of levers that I have like for better performance of the automation, and then additional management because there's additional logging and auditing, and like I mentioned, like the roles-based access and integrations into third-party tools that are common within IT. So things like the ServiceNow and Infoblox and that kind of stuff. So that's like managing your automation, and then there's addition. So moreover, there's other things too now. So there's a private automation hub. So that way you can manage all of your collections and your execution environments in your own environment. And if you create custom content, you can store it there. So it's like a container registry, and it does all these things that allow you to work locally. And then we have the console for the customers, so they can go to that and they can pull down the certified content as a customer, or they can have it synced up with their private environment, or if they're air gapped, there's ways of updating the private repository. So that's another capability. And then the automation mesh is around how we're able to scale out in this new architecture the cluster of controllers. And we have this notion of these execution nodes. So the execution nodes, instead of like installing all the capabilities of the controller on them, it's a very light install. So you can have a smaller VM, or in some cases like container, that you're running this execution node. And all it's doing is executing the playbook locally. So you can position them like near where the target of the automation is. So maybe you have like a lot of latency, like sites that are way out wherever, and geographically separated so far. Like in the old days, you'd have to just like work the best that you could, with SSH, and there's some timers you can adjust for connections and things like that. But now you can position the execution node right there, so there's no latency. You're not bound by latency with launching that job in the execution node. You just have to have connectivity through this automation mesh, which is like a layer 4 TLS connection, like just a layer 4 mesh network back to the cluster, and you'll have better performance that way. Sometimes you might have like a boundary, like segmentation or NAT. So there's a hop node you can use in that case where it just has out-of-bound connectivity back to the cluster, and then that way it can have an execution node sit behind it, and then if there's a firewall or some other security boundary, it will allow that outbound connection. It'll open up a receptor port, and then it'll invoke the automation on the execution node that's sitting behind a segmented zone on SD-WAN or in a DMZ or something like that, and it can work that way too. So it opens up like flexibility, because I may have like a controller that sits on-prem that's managing things in cloud over a VPN or a direct connect or something, or vice versa. I can spin up a cluster of Ansible controller and the other components in AWS or in Google Cloud or in Azure, and they could manage on-prem endpoints too. So it just opens up all these different possibilities. Or you can run a cluster on top of OpenShift too, which is our Kubernetes solution. Wow. Yeah, so it's like pretty much anywhere.
That's a really interesting concept. I mean, the whole concept of edge computing and content delivery networks is really big right now for things like media and big data. And I wouldn't have thought of that type of distributed use case for something like automation, but it makes a lot of sense where you can centrally manage all of your automation, but have a way to sync that to edge nodes that are actually managing the gear, get those jobs to run as close to the endpoints as possible. It makes a lot of sense, just not something I would have thought of from the lens of network automation before.
Yeah, and like in our edge, like Red Hat's edge solution, they've already created like all of the wrapper of like different Ansible validated content around managing our edge, but it will also include like other vendor stuff too, like if you're using Meraki Wireless at edge sites and things like that. So it makes it really easy to spin those up, and then again, you don't have to have your controllers co-located, so that way it's less to manage.
I want to talk about that validated content and the collections from vendors. Now, is that something where vendors go through the process of validating their collections to be used in Ansible? Is that something that came as like a value add when Red Hat kind of took over operations or operationalized Ansible? Is that when that piece happened?
Well, yeah, it happened shortly after they decoupled the core engine from the modules.
Okay.
So that was kind of like the first step needed, because that's why it took so long for Ansible updates, right? Because to have like a major release, they would have to have like all the vendor updates, and they would, time that with updating Ansible. So it really made it hard to be agile. So when they split off, now it's decoupled, right? So the Ansible core engine has no dependency on any of these modules that are now packaged into collections. So when they started the collections, they started the certified collections, but it's taken time. Like not all the vendors adopted it right away, but most of the best of breed ones out there that have already been, working on the community side of things have went through the process. So like an example, like PanOS, like they became certified like I think like 2 or 3 months ago, and that was like the last major one that I recall that a lot of folks were waiting on that one. Like when are we going to have the certified collection? So now we have that. There's one other piece too. So there's validated content, and that actually has a linkage back to when you guys were asking earlier about abstraction. So that one, I can kind of define like how we make things easier because of that. Another thing that's new is the event-driven automation, and we call it event-driven Ansible. So what that's doing is it's another component, right? And it can have a source plugin for like a message broker. So like Kafka, like there's a bunch of different ones. I'm not an expert in a lot of them, but on the networking side of things, I've been using Kafka already for that. And Kafka has integrations into things like Telegraph. So if you're familiar with like streaming telemetry and being able to pull that in and convert it from like protobuf, where normally that would go into like a database, like an influx database, but you can also convert it into JSON structured data and then have that managed in a topic in Kafka. And that can feed our EDA. So effectively, like we can listen to events on devices in real time, as opposed to like the way that Ansible normally works is when you run a playbook, right? That's like a push model. Like you're invoking that playbook, it'll go and like you can gather facts or whatever the playbook's doing. It can learn state or glean operational information from that device. With streaming telemetry, you set that up to where it's called XPath. So it points to an object that's either a configuration object or it's an operational state object. So something like an interface, if it were up or down, you could periodically check that. Or if it changes state, that'll trigger the telemetry. So you can receive these things in real time, as opposed to like in a push model, you have to schedule them. So in the controller, that's another capability it has as a schedule. So I might go out periodically and do compliance checks and check certain operational state to populate a dashboard or something like that. Now with EDA, we can, like as soon as something happens in the network, that particular streaming telemetry can become an event for EDA, and that could create a trigger that launches a playbook in the controller or sends a notification or does something in a workflow to react to it. But I'm not suggesting, like, I tell people, like, even though you can automate remediation for a lot of these things, you probably don't want to, or not yet, for a lot of things, because you just want to be sure. And you normally have like a downtime window and change management and all that kind of stuff anyway. Mm-hmm. But you can at least learn about it and everybody's aware, and you can go out and then automate troubleshooting triage to collect more data. So then when you do open up a ticket, like you'd have it open up a ticket in ServiceNow, and you can have all this data ready. So when somebody else is ready to make that decision to approve it, you can have an approval step and then bam, push the change out to the device. But it was all like a feedback loop. So, very proactive in that regard. So that was the last of the component thing. So I'm sorry I kind of went off track.
No,
where you were going, but
there's a whole lot more to Ansible now than the last time I looked at it. Holy smokes!
Yeah,
it was
that
just
event-driven stuff's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's finally it's grown up a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit.
So we are very biased here, right? Because this is the art of network engineering, and we are getting familiar in this chat with the different network automation components of Ansible. But what are some of the other use cases that people can use from Ansible that's outside of just straight up network automation?
Yeah, so like I work with a team of folks that have different skill sets, so they focus on different domains in IT. So one of our like value props is like, hey, you can automate anything in IT pretty much with Ansible. So it's just really just a matter of if someone hasn't already done it before, just somebody going through the steps of creating a process and building automation around it. But where I think like the bulk of the content and where most of the history of Ansible automation is, and even today, right, is really around, servers. And because Red Hat is RHEL, so like RHEL automation to do like a lot of things like compliance checks and patching, and to integrate into like other tools like Satellite, that help, in that regard as well. So it's like that's another Red Hat product. So they integrate really nicely to do like the, patch updates and remediations and those types of checks together. So a lot of our customers, use Ansible for that particular use case. Another one that has a lot of traction too is just public cloud provisioning. So, there's always that debate like, well, hey, do I want to use something, more like a Terraform, for things that are like immutable? And can I just use like a Terraform in cloud?
Right.
So we work well with Terraform. So we have collections where like Terraform's northbound of Ansible and vice versa. And like Ansible controller is kind of managing the workflow, and Terraform is, a component of that. It just depends, again, like you mentioned earlier, like, does it make sense to use different tools or how you would use the tools in different scenarios? So in cloud, like a lot of the things that are containerized, right, you're going to blow them away. They're disposable. So those are completely immutable. So something like Terraform makes sense because it maintains a state, right? So things like networking in cloud, though, so if you're going to have like, transient gateways between, like using AWS like VPCs, or if you have like express routes and direct connects like with your on-prem into the public cloud or into a colo facility, you don't blow them away. Those devices stay up and running, and they need to be configuration managed, right? So that's where the tool for that would be Ansible. So they kind of go together hand in hand because it's two different purposes. It's like the immutable stuff is really more around like delivering application stacks temporarily and then having the benefit of being able to tear them down so you're not paying for them when you're not using them. But the infrastructure has to be there because it's a part of your infrastructure, because it's even though it's going across clouds, it's your infrastructure, right? So if you have AWS and you network it to Azure, then you have connections into your environment, and maybe you have on and off ramps, with SD-WAN into those things, they're going to be there all the time. So that would be more, configuration management use cases. So there's a lot around that. You mentioned Edge, so that's more emerging, and we see, a lot of traction there. And security. So trying to think. Yeah, probably networking is probably like lower on the totem pole right now in terms of like Ansible, just because some of those other use cases, just people have been automating them longer, so they just had more time for adoption. But now I think it's really going to ramp up on the network side of things. So we're a little bit later to the party, but now that we're starting to understand it, it's like, well, hey, I got 10,000 devices sitting here, I can catch up to you real quick, and I've got like 100 different use cases, so it won't be long to kind of eclipse that stuff. But
and I do see how things like servers and compute have been around a long time as far as automation, because to me, you're probably spinning up those kinds of services up and down much more often than you are switches and routers. And when you do spin up, for instance, 10 servers to be part of this compute cluster, they are more often than not, other than host names and IPs, going to have a lot of the same different configurations. And it's a little bit different when it comes to networking, but like you said, I agree with you that it's starting to become more mainstream to want to be able to manage and automate networks. But I do think that it's a lot around, you mentioned a minute ago, that with networking where you're not necessarily spinning up and spinning down networking services often, the biggest value proposition there is to have standardized configuration management. And that's where things, I think, like Ansible are really able to deliver on that.
Yeah, it's there's some things that kind of cross domains too, like compliance. If that impacts everybody, and sometimes it's the same configuration because maybe perhaps you have like the same NTP servers or DNS configurations, things that are a part of your compliance that span all those different devices. So it's nice having like a platform that you can use to touch all those different types of devices, whether it's a server, or cloud, or networking or security. And you really don't have to worry about all the nuances. You can create a workflow that just checks NTP for, across all of them. And then it either passes or fails. And then you either have, you either react to it or it's a notification, or you create a list, or, populate a report or whatever. Those are becoming more common too, where it's like a cross domain type of thing. But in terms of like networking, there's a lot of very unique nuances to networking that are different than servers and containers and things that, like that. Not just that they're permanent and that you want like a common configuration. It's also difficult to manage the configurations, because really, like in a ideal scenario, it would be like automate everything. So like if you had like a network operations team and a design team, like automate first. So like all of our baseline configurations, we always have automation in mind, and the operations team is always going to make changes and do any testing, based off of automation. Then it would be really easy to have a single source of truth and to ensure that all the configurations and state of the devices are in compliance at any given time. But in reality, it's like you have folks automating, but then you also have people that are going in and out of band to troubleshoot and making changes, and it's not always reconciled. So the next iteration of something, when you go through like a scheduling of a compliance check, or you're making your next configuration change, then you should go and check those devices first and do a drift check to make sure that what you think is the configuration is actually the configuration, because otherwise you may overwrite it. And it was something that somebody like spent hours on troubleshooting and figured something out, but it just didn't make it back to the automation team for them to fix it on the front end, to go and revise like the variable files that they're using for playbooks and things, and to incorporate that into the automation. So a lot of times you'll kind of see that impact where, it's just like, hey, it used to work and now it doesn't. And then somehow the automation broke it. But in fact, it was just like the automation wasn't updated. So as folks become more familiar with like a true DevOps or net DevOps process, they start using repositories and they start incorporating, drift checks and, just making it a lot easier if you do need to make a change, as a result of troubleshooting, or if you're just, making new changes, that you can enforce those policies, pretty easy. And that kind of gets back to like not just running a bunch of playbooks, but having like an automation platform and being able to manage that and to integrate it into like Git repositories and things like that, or other sources of truth for your configuration, like CMDB types of databases, like in your ITSMs and the like, so that way you can check against them too before you make a change and post change, and just a lot of state can change unintentionally, so you could be pulling your hair out, and I think that's a big challenge, is like just adopting a process around that, being all in and not just like dipping the toe.
I think all in is the right term, because you bring up a good point there, and it's more than just automation, because the network state is only, to the automation engine, is only as good as what it knows about. And if it doesn't have the updated state, the updated configuration, then that's when it can cause a lot of problems. So something I want to discuss is, we've been talking about a lot of in-depth use cases around network automation. So let's step back a little bit and think about this from the perspective of somebody who wants to get into Ansible. We'll make it simple. We'll say, a medium-sized enterprise customer wants to start getting into network automation, wants to see what Ansible is all about. Where would they start?
Yeah, so like normally we would want to like kind of look at their current state of the things that they're doing. And you don't want to have like, in terms of like the goals, you want to make it like very attainable for them, kind of like the low-lying types of things, so that they can get a quick win as they're learning. So we would tend to stay more on like the read-only side of things. So you can pretty much go into any environment and you can help them, either through, if they need a compliance type of check, those are pretty easy to set up. So you can go and check like, versions of what's running in each model, which ones do need to be updated. backups, right? So they're safe to do. You can. It's kind of cool with Ansible. You can back up to a Git repository, to a server locally. There's like all these different scenarios of where you can back up like router configs, or really any type of config, whether it's ACI or a Palo Alto firewall, anything that has any type of config, you can easily back that up. So those are like a good starting point too, because they may have something already, but normally whatever they're using is kind of bound into a domain. So like if you're using like DNA Center from Cisco as an example, it's more around like the campus and Wi-Fi, like the Catalyst products. So it does a great job of like, that's already baked into it. You back up the configs as part of it, and it has Swim for like updates and things of that nature. But it's not going to work with some of the other, even like within Cisco solutions. So the backups work the same across different types of devices, firewalls, routers, switches. The backups effectively work the same. So it's another consistent way. So that's a good starting point. So really a lot of the network management types of things, but again, the issue is they're probably using a tool or multiple tools for that. So sometimes the starting may have a little bit of overlap with some of the tools they're already using. But that's one approach. Another approach is that they have a lab environment. Because 9 times out of 10, if they have a lab environment, they probably haven't automated the lab itself. So you can go to town with a lab environment and you can show like all the best practices. And because it's a lab environment, there's no issue with downtime and things like that. Or if you need to break things, it's a great environment to learn. And then by them automating their lab environment, then usually it makes it a lot easier because they can spin up like different scenarios a lot easier and make that more disposable in itself. So I've seen a lot of people like really turn their lab environment into something really cool that they can use without having to build it manually to make changes for different scenarios. Or it's like someone's using the lab environment, so we have to wait until they're done with it. So it's going to add some delay into this particular, if we're working on a project or whatever and we don't have a lab environment, so like you could make it more multi-tenant in nature and things like that. So lab environments are great. And usually those are where we would introduce like the Git repositories and things like CI/CD pipelines. So like kind of introducing some of the other kind of, cooler DevOps types of tools in there too, because it's like, hey, in application development, we have like a notion of development branches, staging branches, and then production. So a development branch would kind of be more like you're messing around with your laptop, or maybe you're using like a lot of simulations or emulations like CML from like a Cisco side of thing, or like GNS or EVE-NG or whatever. It's not real gear. But that's okay because you're really just trying to vet out your configurations or making sure that your automation works, with configurations. But it doesn't really have like a great data plane. And it's definitely not something you can stress test, right? So your staging environment should be like a real lab where you don't have like all the devices, or maybe not even all the same models, but it's close enough. But it's some, actual real gear, or has the actual controller or whatever the solution is. So you can closely represent what you're going to do. So that way you can cover about 80% of the things that would surface there. So that way when you go into production and you do, you never really find everything. But you should, have less surface area, for something to go wrong. So that whole blast radius, right? So when you go into production, maybe I don't need as big of a downtime window, right? I don't have to sit there all weekend. I only need a couple hours, and I know that it's only going to be like a few things we'll have to troubleshoot. We won't have that, that risk of like, oh damn, we're going to have to roll back. Yeah. And then we're going to have to ask for more, kiss the ring of the change management people and, ask for another downtime. Yeah. So you can cover your ass kind of. Well, I don't know if it's
you're good. You're good. A little bit. It's podcast. Yeah. So you mentioned earlier that things have kind of gone to like a container kind of focus, right? So, but can you still install the Ansible core product on any old Linux box, or is that option?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. So it, like I said, Ansible is the gateway. I've always referred to it as the gateway drug to automation, right? So you could do the container thing. You can install it on just a vanilla Linux box, and learning how to do YAML is extremely easy. So get your hands dirty, start playing with Ansible. And you made some great points. A lot of people, when they start their network automation journey, they think they got to like jump in all the way and start automating changes. But, if they've never done that before, it's like, well, what am I supposed to use this thing? Well, validation of all your network configuration doesn't meet any sort of, company standard. Are you, checking the versions of all your devices to make sure everything's up to date. And then if you have to, you can automate the software updates themselves, which is pretty cool. I've seen a lot of people do that with various playbooks and stuff.
I'm working on some of that right now.
Yeah. And then, once you trust how the platform works, then you can start get information, start making, smaller changes and stuff like that. And then just kind of build up from there. And then, I'm just from what you've discussed this past hour on what all the larger Ansible product does, it's crazy. Everything. I'm still thinking about that event-driven thing, interfaces go down and you can start, pulling troubleshooting information, just running show commands and gathering that stuff back in some automated fashion for somebody else to triage later. But, I'm thinking like, capturing logs as close to when the event happens. So that way you have that information right there, stored safely in a text file or attached to a ticket or whatever the case is. So just some really cool stuff going on over there.
You could use syslogs too instead of streaming telemetry.
Oh, okay.
Right? So,
all right.
Yeah, that could be another source for it too. So, or like event of the EEE can trigger like events. So like you could use that too, kind of in conjunction with it. So, but that one's a little bit hard because you have to do like a little bit of tickle scripting and all that kind of stuff. But,
gotcha. Yep.
But like all that stuff works. There's like tons of different ways. But for me, like the streaming telemetry kind of covers everything that the syslogs do anyway.
Yeah.
So it's just a matter of, there is a bit of a challenge because XPath. So what that is instead of like XML. So XML for me, I get a headache trying to read XML, right? Because you have the open and closing tags, and you're trying to find like the values in the middle of this thing is all zigzaggy everywhere, and there's a lot of it. It's like, oh my god. So XPath is like a very direct path to whatever that object is. So it's kind of hard to remember those two, but there's tools to determine what they are. And there's some really good like GitHub repositories where they have a bunch of examples. But Cisco has the Yang Suite tool that you can run like a little Python application. You can search for XPath. So pretty much like anything like command you would do, what would be the XPath for it, and it'll show what it is. And then you just drop that in there. So it could be like the state of the interfaces, or like I want to know when the configuration changes because someone made a config on the device, and I want to be notified of that. And then have that maybe run a config drift check right after it happens to make sure something important didn't change on the device. Gotcha. So that's like another use case.
Yeah.
But I'm happy to show, like, I can demo EDA if you guys want to see that sometime. There's a lot of cool things.
I know I do. Yeah, that sounds really cool. So time flies when you're having fun, Tony. So if people want to learn more either about the open source project or the larger enterprise product, where can people go to learn more about Ansible?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different sites. So there's one like whole like category of different labs that are self-paced. So normally I would show people that link. I could can I paste links in here or?
If you want to paste them in the chat, or if you want to send them to us via email, or you can even send them to me in LinkedIn chat. I can add them to the show notes. So for right now, if you just want to explain what the links are, and then I will have all the links available in the show notes. Okay,
cool. Yeah, because I have like different ones for different purposes.
Gotcha.
So the self-paced labs are really cool because you get like a working AAP controller, and you can do like the scripted labs that are a part of it. Or you can actually, because you have admin access to it, you can create your own job templates and playbooks and things there and run it locally to use it for like testing and things like that. So you can kind of think of it as like a DevNet sandbox.
Oh, okay.
So it's curated, but you can use it like however you want, and it does have like a time duration. So once that time's over, then you'd have to schedule another one. So it's a great way to learn that. Another tool that I didn't talk about that's important too is the command line. So in like the older days, I mentioned, you install Ansible core and you can install it locally. And typically you're using like the Ansible-playbook commands, or Ansible if you want to talk like directly to a module, or Ansible Vault, if you want to encrypt your usernames or your passwords. or credentials rather. So like all that stuff still exists, but we have this new command line tool called the Ansible Navigator. And the Ansible Navigator uses the execution environments too. So that way, if you're working like in what I call like your test or your dev environment, you can use the Navigator and you can work out all your playbooks and run them locally. And then when you're done, you can commit them into your repository and then pull them into the controller. So that way you don't have to like toggle between the GUI and what you're doing. You can work locally. And it's the exact same container that you're using locally as the one that you would run as an execution environment for that particular project in the controller. So there's that. Another thing is like we kept talking about like abstraction and the validated content. So the validated content, it sort of intersects with like where should you start. So like I still like the same thing. I really recommend like doing more of like the read only and staying more in the lab environment till you kind of build your skills and have the correct chops before you go out and make changes into your actual production environments. But when you do go into production, in the old days, it was a little bit more difficult because you really needed to know how you were configuring those devices from the command line. Mm-hmm. So like when people would start out like with Ansible, and it really wasn't like that long ago, but let's say like if we went back in time, like maybe like 4 years, most of that automation was using Jinja 2 templates, which also is a Python thing too, right? So in those templates, it's very sensitive to the syntax of the command line, because if you create a template and you're off in like the spacing, especially for like a router config, you're going to have an error because it's not going to be a valid input into the device. Right. So you really would have to know, you can't get away from knowing the command line in that regard. So when we moved forward, we moved into like the next like evolution was the resource modules. So in the resource modules, the way that they work is they interact with the device, and we have a notion of state. So this state is where Ansible, once it makes that connection through SSH or through the REST API, it'll look at what the configuration is in the device, and it'll look at your configuration that you have, your intended configuration that's either like in one of your variable files. And then variable files, they could exist in like an inventory, but that's not best practice. That's just for like real high level stuff. Mm-hmm. The group would be for like you organize the groups of devices and groups like types of devices into groups. So you could have group vars. And then host vars are very specific to the device configuration because, normally they have different IP addresses and host names and access list entries and all that kind of stuff. So you would have those. So the state would say like, if I have the state of merged in a resource module, it'll look to see what config's in there, and it'll look at your config, like wherever you set those variables. And there's like more locations where you could set variables, but just, for the sake of simplicity, it's like in one of those ones that I mentioned. Mm-hmm. So it'll compare what's there and what's in the device. If it sees the config's already there, and it has the state of merged, it's not going to change anything. It's only going to merge in something that's new, which is sort of like how repos work too. Sure. So if it sees something that doesn't exist, it'll merge that in and leave everything else alone. But then there's also other states. So there's replaced. So replace will kind of do the same thing. If it sees something that's not in there that's in your config, it'll add it. But if it sees something that is there that's not in your config, it would replace it by removing it. So that one's used a lot for like compliance checks if you want to do the remediation. So to kind of take that a step further, you can run a resource module in check mode where it just tells you the things that it would change or would replace. Or you could run it in run mode and it actually makes the change on the device. So usually it's a 2-step process. You go out and learn and see like, what do I need to change? And then you would execute it in run mode later and actually make the change. Okay. But you could use the exact same playbooks. You just run it in check mode versus run mode. Yep. Overwrite is similar, but it removes like the entire config wholesale and then replace or overwrites it like with what your config is. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't work well. You never want to use that with like access lists and VLANs. You would always want to use the replaced. Yeah. So it'll be very precise in what it's taking out. And then there's deleted. So deleted's really cool because in the old days of Jinja 2, what would happen is you'd have a Jinja template and that would represent a configuration. Best practice would be to have a backup of that config. And then if you made a mistake or something and you needed to fail back, then you would replace it with that entire configuration. But then all this reconvergence happens, right? Because the whole config needs to come back up again. So your routing protocols and your ARP tables and CAM tables and all that stuff, you have to wait for all that. in a resource module, the state of deleted would only delete the config from that one resource module. So a resource module is very scoped and specific to like a protocol or a type of configuration in the router or switch or whatever the device is. So it could just be like OSPF or BGP or SNMP, or there's a bunch of different ones that are different types of configurations in a device. But it's only going to delete that config, the one that you sent. Gotcha. So that's very less, it's less intrusive. It's going to be very quick, and that blast radius is very small, and you can make that change very quickly. So delete it is what that does. So you have all these states. And then the other part of it is you're not even dealing with the command lines, you're dealing with structured data. So it creates like a YAML dictionary or list, depending on the documentation will tell you in the config if it's like a dictionary or a list of dictionaries. That all goes back like just normal programming stuff, but it's like the structure of that data. So what these resource modules do is when they look, like I mentioned, like they look to see what config's in there, it shows you the before, right? And that's that configuration. So it shows you the before, and then it shows you the command lines or whatever the native construct is, REST APIs, or like in Juniper, it's netconf. So you see that in like the XML or whatever. It'll show you whatever that is. And then it shows you the after that it either applies because you have it in like a run mode, or it shows you the after doesn't change when it's in that check mode, but you do see like what the config that it needs to push is. So it's like a built-in diff. And then that's very useful because you don't have to do any programming to make that work. It's baked into the resource modules. Yeah. So resource modules are great, but like to use them, you still have to, know how to use, like if you're going to create like roles and that type of thing to like make purpose-built playbooks that are using the resource modules. So there's a little bit of effort in that. So the validated content, what these are is, at least this first round of it, this first iteration from Red Hat is we have the network base. So it covers like all of the basic network use cases. So what happens there is you have like this role that's kind of like a role at a higher layer than like the other roles that are focused on the specific like resource modules. And you don't have to really write anything into the playbook. You just list out like what resource modules you want to interact with, and it'll go out to a device that hasn't been automated yet, and it'll ingest that configuration and turn that configuration into all of the YAML files that represent all the resource modules that work for that device. And then if you make changes to them, to those configurations, you can push it back out again. And if you have, replace, as the state or whatever, it'll go out and remove things that shouldn't be there and replace it with the configs that should be. Yeah. So that one, like you really don't have to know much at all. So it's not really like a low code or a no code. It's like an easy code type of paradigm around that. But then for the ones that we have we do have validated content around BGP and OSPF and firewalls and some other things. That list will continue to build. So in the meantime, the basic one covers a lot, but you have to do like a little bit more in the playbook. Yep. But they're getting to the point where it's kind of like a single task of using this resource module that does like all these different things for you. So you may only have like just a little bit of code that isn't represented in like a resource module. So you may still have like a corner case, like this little one-off Jinja 2 template, or you might use like a config module with like the lines command or something like that parameter, just to do like these little bits and pieces. But the idea is like, you're up and running, and it's very, very simple to get started using the validated content. The hard part is the people that are like been using the older ways for a long time. In some ways, like for them, they have to refactor some of their playbooks now to take advantage of the newer paradigm, because you want it to kind of fall in that framework, because now it's really easy because everything, again, like there is some work involved, but a lot of it's done for you. So you can really get a long way with a very like low, barrier to entry with the validated content. And vendors are getting involved too. So this is like multi-vendor, what I'm talking about. And then the vendors are providing their own validated content for their use cases for things like, Arista's, CVP and like Cisco's ACI, like those types of things will become, validated content at some point. The customers will just go and grab it. Like I need the Cisco validated content, boom, it just a little bit of work and I'm up and running. Wow. The old days, it was like, I got to write playbooks for like 2 months to get everything the way I need it. So
that's awesome. That's great. So, all right, and again, you'll get those links over to me, and we'll put those in the show notes for people to
Yeah, I'll give you links on like the validated content, the EDA. I also have like a network automation meetup that I do like at least once a month.
Oh, okay.
And that one is just like a meetup where we do like hands-on labs, and it's all just networking automation. So it's always a network use case. So I'll give you guys that link too.
Awesome. And then I found an Ansible specific YouTube channel.
Well, there is. Yeah, there's actually a couple different ones. There's the product one and the community.
Okay. Cool. We'll include those in the show notes as well. Tony, how about yourself? Is there a way that people can follow you? Are you on Twitter, LinkedIn, anywhere that we can share with our listeners?
Yeah, on Twitter, it's at Dubiel, TDUBIEL. I'm not as active on there as I used to be. On LinkedIn, what the heck's mine? The LinkedIn's like coding Dubiel. So CODING, Dubiel, DUBIEL. Or at coding Dubiel with like the front part of the LinkedIn URL. And then I do have like a meetup site. I'll give you the link for that too, that has the events listed. So it's free. People can just join it, and then they'll get a notification of like when there is an event, and then they'll have like the link for the conference call for it.
Awesome. Tony, this has been great. I've learned a ton about what Ansible's been up to the last few years since I really last dug into it. Tim, do you have any last minute questions here for Tony?
No questions last minute. I just think it was really interesting to hear about the evolution of Red Hat, because over the years, because AJ, you nailed it on the head. You've gone through blog posts in the past and using, the core Ansible Tower to do some of the network automation to see what Red Hat has taken and done with Ansible on top of the core that's been there forever. So it was really cool to kind of step through time to see how Ansible's involved. So Tony, thank you for joining us and really teaching us that. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me and keeping me on track. I mean, there's so much to talk about. It's kind of hard. Like, I feel like I'm throwing everything at you, throwing it all at
the wall. I didn't realize there was so much to it. So definitely, I think there's a couple of things that we could follow up with some YouTube videos. I mean, I'm personally really interested in the event-driven Ansible stuff. So that might be a good follow-up to do. But anyway, thank you so much for joining us. And we'll see you next time on another episode of the Art of Network Engineering podcast.
Hey there, friends. We hope you enjoyed listening to that episode just as much as we did recording it. If you want to hear more, make sure you subscribe to the show in your favorite podcatcher. You can also give that little bell rascal a little ringy-dingy so you know when we release new episodes. If you're social like we are, you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram. We are at Art of NetEng. That's Art of NETENG. You can also find us on that weaving web that is the internet at artofnetworkengineering.com. There you'll find our show notes and some blog articles from the hosts, guests, and other friends who just like getting their thoughts down on that virtual paper. Until next time, friends, thanks for listening.